This is BTV World. I am SYED SHABAHAT and you're watching Faultlands. Ladies and gentlemen, as you have been viewing in our show since February, we have been covering the problem between Russia and Ukraine because we always believed this can be the deadliest of all armed conflicts in the world. And the new developments that have taken place during the last 2 weeks have increased the chances of this becoming the deadliest of all conflicts in the world. The major developments that have taken place during last week or week and a half are three. First and foremost is that Russia, after deciding to annex 4 regions, have had a referendum which are called sham referendum, and as a result of these referendum have annexed 4 different regions of Ukraine, thereby making them internal part of Russia. Now, any attack in any of these regions, Russia will consider it to be attack on mainland Russia, for which, according to Russia's nuclear doctrine, Russia will have a permission by its command to use, God forbid, nuclear weapons. The other important development is that Nord Stream pipeline giving gas from Russia to Germany has been sabotaged. By whom? We don't know. But the evidence is overwhelming, and Russia believes this to be one of the most serious attempts to attack on Russian interest. By destroying this gas pipeline, Russia's bargain chip with Germany has been taken away. Another important part of the same problem is that now Europe will be starving for gas in the harsh winters that have approached. And lastly, the use of technology and the use of American intelligence has intensified the attacks by Ukrainian and have increased the damages for Russian army. All of this in today's program with one of the most robust panel of guests. Watch the package prepared by Team Faultlands before I invite my first guest to the program.
The prospects of diplomatic resolution of Ukraine crisis remain bleak as fears of nuclear escalation mount. Russia launched referendums aimed at annexing 4 occupied regions of Ukraine, drawing condemnation from Kiev and Western nations who dismissed the votes as a sham and pledged not to recognize their results. Russian defense military would seek to call up 300,000 additional soldiers to bolster its military in Ukraine. The mobilization is the first since World War II and comes after Ukraine made gains in a rapid counteroffensive this month. Ukrainian forces have recaptured key towns and villages in northern Kharkiv region and have made a slower but still significant progress in the southern Kherson region. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said it showed Mr. Putin wanted to drown Ukrainian blood. In his televised address, Russian President Putin stated that the West was engaged in nuclear blackmail and that Moscow had lots of weapons to reply. Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, has issued another nuclear warning, stating the demagogues across the ocean and in Europe are not going to die in a nuclear apocalypse. The US has warned Russia of catastrophic consequences if it launches a nuclear attack on Ukraine.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. My first guest to today's show is Mr. Clint Ehrlich, who is a foreign policy analyst based in the United States. We have requested him to be guest in our program, and he's joining me over from United States. Clint Ehrlich, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Clint, it's such an honor and pleasure to have you in my show. Nord Stream gas pipeline has been attacked, as you might have also been following the developments. Is Russia being pushed to take the extreme possible military measures? What else can be the consequence of this attack?
It is Russia's assessment that this was an attack carried out either by the United States or by Ukraine with American assistance, and we can expect that Russia's response will be calibrated to that fact. Russia has many options for how it may respond to the sabotage of these pipelines. One of them would be to destroy the undersea cables that are used to carry internet traffic from the United States to Europe. Or alternatively, Russia could seek to further intensify the war in Ukraine. It has abstained from targeting certain critical command and control infrastructure of the Ukrainian government, and it's possible that a reprisal towards these attacks on the pipelines could be the use of cruise missiles against that infrastructure.
Despite the fact, Clint, that nobody has taken responsibility for it, but Who else benefits more than the United States of America by breaching this gas pipeline, which was so fundamental and so necessary for Russia to have a leverage in talks with Europe?
It's very clear that this attack does not serve Russia's interest, and it's equally clear that it advances the interests of America, Ukraine, and Poland. It benefits America and Ukraine because now one of Russia's critical points of leverage through which it could attempt to create dissension in NATO and in the European Union has been removed. Russia no longer has this leverage point over Germany, and so Russia's ability to navigate diplomatically has now been limited. And it benefits Poland because Poland was the primary energy competitor to Russia in terms of supplying these other European states. And so now this is a boon towards Poland's status as an energy power. There's no scenario where this benefits Russia, because if Russia wanted to continue to cut off the gas from these pipelines, it could do so from the source. It didn't need to destroy its own infrastructure, and any claims of that from the United States are simply unfounded and silly, frankly.
And how do you believe would Germany respond to it? Because the crises are going to be worst for Germany now. It's an industrial hub. It cannot survive without having a permanent source of gas.
Because this was a joint Russian-German project, I don't believe that the United States would undertake this kind of sabotage operation without first conferring with the German government, and if not receiving approval, at least informing the German government of the intention to conduct this operation against the pipelines. And so I don't believe that this attack came as a surprise to Germany. I believe that Germany knew in advance that this action would be taken. It's simply a matter of appearances now, that the Germans cannot act as if they were tipped off in advance. And similarly, other states in NATO, they're not stupid. They understand that this is an action that benefits the United States and Ukraine, and one that was not undertaken by Russia, but publicly they will continue to act as if this was something that Russia undertook in order to try to maintain the appearance of an alliance against Russia.
Clint, my point was that the consequences would be most severe for Germany. Would you agree with me on that or not? Because Russia is largely an industrial empire, and its energy requirements are far more than any other nation.
Well, to be clear, I don't know that the Germans agreed to this. I simply believe that they were informed in advance. And so as a junior partner in NATO to the United States, they may have been put in the position where they simply had to accept what they were told, even if it was contrary to their interest. I suspect that the pitch from the Biden administration was basically that these were not reliable sources of energy, and that Russia would inevitably cut them off as part of its economic warfare. And so for that reason, it was better to simply destroy them. And I suspect that the Biden administration also pledged American support in attempting to help source other sources of energy. But as you pointed out, there are not adequate sources of energy to replace the gas that Germany would normally be receiving from Russia.
Clint, recently in a surprising development, Ukrainian forces have taken back 3,000 square kilometers from the Russian forces. Putin has announced to deploy another 300,000 reserve military forces in the same area. How do you comment on this development?
Well, these two things are connected. The reason that Russia lost that territory in Kharkov was because it was defended by an insufficient number of Russian troops. In particular, the Russian forces were using largely military police without heavy weapons to try to defend that area, and the Ukrainians were able to mass their forces to achieve a 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 numerical advantage in concentrated firepower, which drove the Russians out. And so the purpose of this mobilization is not so much to have more frontline troops that are going to be able to take additional territory from Ukraine, but for Russia to be able to consolidate the territory that it's already held, to avoid situations where Ukraine can mount that kind of counteroffensive against undermanned Russian positions, and then to allow Russian contracted troops and special forces to continue attempting to push forward.
And Clint, would you expect a counteroffensive by Russia to reclaim this lost territory?
I believe that Russia's ultimate goal does include retaking that territory in Kharkov and also mounting a broader counteroffensive in the south of the country to push towards Odessa and to ultimately make Ukraine a landlocked country. It's unclear whether Russia will truly be able to achieve that, but I certainly expect a counteroffensive in the north around Kharkov because that was territory that the Russians held and where they promised the inhabitants that it was always going to be a part of Russia. And that promise has not been kept to date. And so I expect Russia to take actions in order to fulfill it.
Now let's talk about some diplomatic developments. Diplomatic development that might have severe consequences. And the first and foremost is a sham referendum. Now the numbers that we have seen with regards to this referendum are surprising. More than 90% people have supposedly voted in favor of Russia. Why Russia has done that? What can be the rationale behind this referendum?
I think it's inherently impossible to conduct a legitimate referendum in the midst of a war like this where so many people are displaced. And so on its face, it's clear that these are not reliable procedures for making a decision. Instead, the goal of the referendums is to send a signal to the international community about Russia's willingness to defend this territory. By making this part of Russia, it changes Russia's nuclear doctrine, and it underscores the fact that there are no off-ramps for Putin, and that the only way forward is further escalation.
Clint, if I understood you correctly, you're trying to say that this has increased the risk of going toward a much larger scale war.
It absolutely increases the risks of escalation because now we're facing a situation where Russia has declared that this is part of its territory and that it's willing to use nuclear weapons to defend that territory at the same time that the United States and NATO have declared that under no circumstances will they allow the territory to remain in Russian hands. And so what we're looking at is something akin to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there's this foreseeable risk of nuclear conflict, and all that we can hope for is that cooler heads prevail and that the crisis can be de-escalated. But for the foreseeable future, this is a very dangerous situation, and one where I think that the Western calm and the Western acceptance of the idea that there's no risk of use of nuclear weapons is frankly naive and a little bit scary because it suggests that the West will continue pushing Russia until perhaps it's too late.
All right. I got your point, Clint. Now tell me, how would this affect the war at large, and how do you believe NATO might respond to it?
I'm not happy with the way that the Europeans have approached this conflict precisely for the reason that you mentioned. They are not taking seriously the risk of nuclear weapons potentially being used in mainland Europe and the risk of fallout that that would entail. But let's be clear, this risk of nuclear war is not limited to Europe. The United States has signaled through back channels that if Russia uses nuclear weapons against Ukraine, that the United States will respond in some unspecified way, likely with conventional attacks, although potentially with nuclear attacks against Russia. And if that were to happen, it's likely that Russia might retaliate against the United States. And so we see a foreseeable chain of tit-for-tat escalation that could lead us to a global nuclear war, just like there was that risk during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what's shocking is that at that time, analysts were terrified at that prospect and they took it very seriously. And today, it's like we've lost our capacity for imagination, and the idea of global nuclear war is so unthinkable that people no longer appreciate the very real risk that continues to exist.
As you said, we are seriously heading toward the nuclear escalation. All of this will be happening thousands of miles away from the United States. It's Europe that is at risk. Do you believe the Europeans would be happy with this development?
In a perfect world, we would certainly like to see the United Nations play a larger role in ending this conflict and in de-escalating the war and eliminating the risk of nuclear peril that the world currently faces. Unfortunately, what we're seeing instead is an attempt by the Western powers to hijack the United Nations and to make it something very different than it has been historically. There's actually been talk now in the West of attempting to remove Russia's veto power in the UN Security Council. And that would convert the United Nations into something more akin to the League of Nations that failed to stop World War II. In effect, it would make the United Nations not a truly international organization where Russia and China are recognized as equals to the West, but instead a Western organization, much like NATO. And so that effort needs to be resisted at all costs. But even in the best case scenario, I'm skeptical that the United Nations can have much of a role in ending this conflict, because ultimately that responsibility and that power lies only in Washington and in Moscow. And so the question is, which of those two capitals will blink first? Which of the two leaders, President Biden and President Putin, will make the decision to de-escalate this conflict? And in practical terms, it's much more likely to be President Biden, because his future domestically, politically, does not depend on the results of this war. The American people are not invested in whether these territories are held by Russia or by the United States, whereas in Russia, President Putin's entire political future, his hold on power, frankly, his life depends on success in this war. And that's why I believe that people who are serious about attempting to find a solution need to focus on lobbying the West to change its policies, because that's really the only foreseeable way to stop this conflict from continuing to escalate. And if it does escalate, there's no limit to how bad it could be.
Thank you very much, Clint Ehrlich, for your time, and thank you very much for being guest in the program. Ladies and gentlemen, Clint Ehrlich is one of the experts and authority on the subject, and I'm now joined by Mr. Gabriel Nerona. He's former advisor to State Department and an expert of the affairs of Russia. He also speaks Russian and Ukrainian language. Gabriel, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Ali.
Gabriel, the Nord Stream gas pipeline has been attacked. It has been breached. Russia's bargain chip has been taken away, snatched away from her hands. What do you think will happen as a consequence of it?
Well, it was originally until both the Europeans and the United States sanctioned it. What Russia is doing right now is they're squeezing the leverage that they have over Germany, but really over Europe as a whole, especially trying to make Europeans suffer individually this winter without access to natural gas. There's concern that a lot of Europeans just won't have the ability to heat their homes this winter. The hope for Russia is that puts a lot of pressure on European governments to pressure Ukraine into having some sort of ceasefire or some sort of peace deal with Russia. That's not good, because a ceasefire for Russia, while it still has Ukrainian territory, just means that you're granting Russia all the territory that it has illegally taken over. The war needs to end on Ukraine's terms, not Russia's terms. And so Russia is trying to do this very adept information warfare against the Europeans by really attacking just the core. One of the core parts of daily life for Europeans is just their ability to heat their homes.
And would you allow me to say that the entire Europe is now going to pay the price of this massive development?
It really hits all of Europe, because look, just because one country can't get its gas, that also affects the rest of the European chain, because Germany's going to go to other providers. Recently, Olaf Scholz just went to UAE to secure gas supplies from Abu Dhabi. That means that a country like Denmark will have to go somewhere else to find their natural gas, and it will just reverberate all through Europe. This is a global market for gas, but it is one where Europeans are fighting each other desperately right now to ensure that their country can get natural gas supplies, can get electricity supplies to carry over the winter. It's interesting, that's happening at the same time that European countries are shutting down their nuclear reactors. We saw the Netherlands just shut down a nuclear reactor, not for any safety issues, just for political reasons. Germany, there were many fights over its nuclear reactors. Ultimately, the German government made the good decision to keep 3 nuclear reactors on that they had originally planned to shut down at the end of this year. So we're starting to see some reality coming back for Europeans, but no, it is going to affect all of Europe this winter. It could be a very difficult winter there for people.
Gabriel, just stop here. I mean, I'm sorry to interject, but you just said nuclear power plants are being shut down. That doesn't make sense. Europe is facing serious energy crisis. Why European nations are shutting down their own power plants? How would you explain this to me?
It's really this challenge between what are called the green movements in Europe, who, even though nuclear power is extremely safe and it's very clean energy, there's a lot of people who, for various ideological reasons, have opposed nuclear power in their communities. Sometimes it's paranoia that a nuclear power plant could explode. Sometimes it's actually more that they want to really hasten people to move towards solar and wind for economic reasons. Largely that's at the economic interest of those industries, and they try to foment these public opinion campaigns against nuclear power to benefit their own industries. In the last 10 years, that was a very strong movement. This year and last year, we've seen this global resurgence of nuclear power. A lot of countries sort of coming back and realizing that they want to have nuclear power again. It makes sense. If you're getting rid of fossil fuels, it's a reliable source of energy. It doesn't require the wind to be blowing or the sun to be shining. You can just have nuclear energy. So I think we're seeing some change in Europe coming back in favor of nuclear again.
Gabriel, the cost of this development is also going to be very severe for Russia. What do you think will be the cost that Russia is going to pay for this extremely tragic development?
Look, Russia is now making more in energy exports revenue than it was before the war. It's had its highest oil revenue in over 10 years. So Russia's economy is actually doing better than everyone thought it would. Partly because, in my view, the sanctions that have been imposed by the Biden administration aren't very strong sanctions. They're not very encompassing because the United States and Europe don't want to pay the costs that come when you sanction a country like Russia. I think what Russians are more concerned about is whether their sons or their brothers or their husbands are going to get drafted into this war. We've seen Putin call for the mobilization of 300,000 soldiers. That sparked these mass migrations out of Russia. We see at the Georgian border, the Finnish border, the Kazakh border, lines going 10 kilometers in some places, according to reports, of people just trying to flee the country. That, I think, is what's more worrying for Russia right now.
But Gabriel, don't you think it is NATO that is marching toward the east? It is NATO that is horrifying and bullying Russia. It is not Russia that is marching towards NATO, and therefore it's not NATO, it's not Russia that's going to be blamed for this problem. At least that is what the Russian says. How would you contest this argument?
Look, Ukraine is not part of NATO. Russia has about 10% of its border, probably even less, about 5% of its border borders NATO countries. NATO is not an aggressive alliance. NATO does not attack countries unless it is attacked. That's Article 5 of NATO. And so this was sort of a good propaganda line that the Russians have used for decades to try to prevent the alliance from growing and using that to intimidate other countries. Look, Russia is the one that invaded Ukraine, not the other way around. NATO didn't invade Russia. Even now, NATO weapons, they are given to Ukraine with the explicit direction that they are not allowed to be used, fired into Russian territory because they don't want to offend Russia in this kind of scenario and give it excuses to do even more attacks against Ukraine. So no, I don't agree with that line. And look, even at the end in February, before Russia was invading, Ukraine was talking about pledges that it wouldn't join NATO, and that wasn't enough. Ultimately, all Putin wanted was an excuse to invade Ukraine. He's made it about these sort of weird assertions that Ukraine has always been part of Russia, which is not the case. It's actually the reverse, that Russia was part of Ukraine once upon a time, about 600 years ago. And so it's all these strange lines that Russia uses. They're just cycling through reasons for them to justify their invasion.
All right, Gabriel, let's talk about Sham referendum. Now, I have some numbers for you. As a result of these transparent referendums, 93% ballots have been cast in the province of Zaporizhia, I'm sorry for my pronunciation, 87% in Kherson region, 98% in Luhansk, and 99% in Donetsk. These are overwhelming numbers. These numbers show that Russians are extremely popular, and these regions were quite desperate to become a part of Russia, isn't it?
It's interesting. They don't actually come out and vote. There aren't even polling stations. They don't have ballot boxes. The way that votes have been collected in these regions is that you have Russian soldiers going door to door, knocking on apartment doors with their guns in hand, and they give a sheet of paper to the resident, and they say, you will check this box, which says you agree to join Russia. If you don't check that box, the soldier threatens to shoot you. That's not voting. That's a complete farce. It's just a piece of propaganda that Russia wants to use. It has nothing to do with voting. It has nothing to do with democracy. It's also important to know that these votes are illegal in both Ukrainian law and in international law. So the Ukrainian Constitution, Article, I believe, 79, says that any attempts to change the territory of Ukraine have to be done through nationwide referendums, not territorial referendums. That's the Constitution which every Ukrainian agreed to, and they've amended it multiple times to reflect that. And so this isn't valid under Ukrainian law. And then the UN Charter says that illegal annexation by force is also illegal under the UN Charter. And so this has no basis in domestic Ukrainian law, no basis in international law. And again, it's soldiers pointing guns at residents and telling them to check a box.
But Gabriel, what can be the rationale behind this referendum at this point in time when the war is not over, when Russia is not even enjoying 100% control on these territories? Most of the areas are militarily disputed.
Yeah, I do. And it's actually very dangerous because there's the threat that Russia would actually use nuclear weapons down the road. So in Russia's nuclear doctrine, they say that nuclear weapons are permitted to be used in the event of existential threats against the Russian territory. So by annexing these parts of Ukraine into Russia, in their view, they are saying that these parts are now Russian territory, and if Ukrainian troops advance, that Russia would then be legitimate in their use of nuclear weapons. That's a very dangerous scenario we're heading into, and ultimately the United States and the West shouldn't fall for this. This is blackmail. It's extortion, and the West shouldn't tolerate it. Countries like China, India, Pakistan that have nuclear weapons as well shouldn't tolerate this kind of behavior. It violates every international treaty that any of these countries have all signed, this kind of behavior.
And Gabriel, Russians always believe that winters are their friends. So don't you think winters are going to stand on side of Russians?
They think that, and I think the Ukrainians think that as well, for similar but different reasons. And I don't know what's going to happen this winter. I don't think anyone knows what's going to happen this winter. And once we've emerged out of it, we will see which side got a better hand in the war, whether the Russians were able to mobilize their forces, whether the Ukrainians were lost territory or gained territory, what happened to the Russian economy, to the Ukrainian economy. This could be 6 months out. In my estimation, maybe about 6 months from now, we'll start having peace talks again, and that being something that is seriously considered.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for being a guest in our program.
Thank you, absolutely. Thanks, Ali, for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Gabriel Nerona. We'll take a break and join you back with second segment of the program. Stay with us. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Now, since we have heard from two different speakers from United States, it would not be good if we don't hear from the Russian side of it. I have invited Leonid Sevin, who is a foreign policy analyst based in Moscow, who is going to help us to understand the Russian version of the same story. Welcome to the show, Mr. Sevin.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Sevin, who has attacked the Nord Stream pipeline? The guest I had before you believes that United States cannot be blamed for it.
We see that there are few actors who are interested to do such kind of sabotage. Baltic states, Finland, Poland, Ukraine, and United States. But only United States have technical equipment to do such kind of diversion. Not only technical, but military skills. In summer, there was military exercise, Baltic Ops, and there was some kind of experiment with mine and research underwater. And just few days before, there was also military activity of United States vessels and American aircraft and helicopters. And some weeks before, President of United States, Joe Biden, openly told that United States will stop Nord Stream pipeline. When there was question how you will do it, he told, we will do it. So we see that the real fact of American involvement in such kind of diversion. And of course, it's a very serious geopolitical threat, not only to Russia, because it's equipment, Russian property, but also to European states and especially Germany, because the price of electricity and energy itself, it will be serious impact of German economic sector, especially metal, chemical, pharmaceutical industry. And what will do Germany with this type of crisis? They will need to relocate production to other countries, and not to China or Asian countries like in 90s, for example, during the years of globalization process, but probably into United States. So we see the benefit from this sabotage only for United States. And of course, Russia and European countries need to cooperate about investigation of this.
Mr. Seven, tell us about the utility of this pipeline that we are talking about. And also tell me what can be the consequences for the trade between Russia and Europe after the breach of this pipeline.
Actually, there was a kind of misunderstanding how Nord Stream pipelines work now. It was not for transit natural gas for the moment, but there was technical gas inside. And we use for the moment only transit through Ukrainian territory. It's another type of pipelines on the land. And we use it for export gas to Germany. So we still doing our obligation in face of European countries. And of course, Ukraine also gets part of this natural gas for our needs. So it's only about Nord Stream. And it's another type of geopolitical idea, just to stop this pipeline, to stop cooperation between Russia and Germany. And we see that the United States promoted this idea for years, not only just a few months before and when military operations started in Ukraine, but many years ago.
We understand that Russia has been cornered completely. We understand that Russia is technically now in a war against the entire West. How's the public opinion at large in Russia? How the people of Russia are seeing these developments?
Yes, in his own speech, Russian President Vladimir Putin already told that we will use all means to protect Russian territory and Russian people. He told that it is not bluff, it's very serious. And of course, Russia is preparing for any type of provocations. But this incident with Nord Stream pipelines, I see that it's kind of escalation between collective West and Russia. And of course, there's a lot of many other reasons for escalation. For example, there are a lot of other types of pipelines and the activity of trade vessels in the sea routes and of aircrafts, etc. And NATO now bring more equipment, weapon, and soldiers. Of course, kind of private security service, etc., to Ukraine. And Ukraine is just a battle of escalation. And the decision recently done about partial mobilization is about this, just to stop this type of escalation in Ukraine.
All right, Mr. Seven, there's one other important thing that I want you to talk about. and that is Ukrainians reclaiming 300,000 square kilometers of territory back from Russia. How do you see this development?
Yes, more soldiers and officers need to very long front line, but they will be act only on this border. They will not act on other regions of Ukraine. It mostly will be conducted by Russian air forces and artillery, and already battalion and army that located in these regions. So it's only for reason of stabilization of new territories. You see that there was a referendum in all 4 ex-regions of Ukraine, and people would like to join Russia. So it will be new Russian territories, and they also need to organize security to protect borders, etc. It's a kind of routine work. And of course, there will be continuation of a special military operation in Ukraine till the end.
And how about these sham referendums, Mr. Sabin? Do you believe this is a wise thing to do, to hold referendums when the war is not over? To have referendums when the militaries are fighting, even in these areas? To have referendums when the conflict is not over? How do you believe this is going to help Russia?
I would like to remind that there was second type referendum organized in Donetsk People Republic and Lugansk People Republic, because on 2014 they already organized such kind of plebiscite, and it's will of the people. A referendum is kind of direct democracy, and people would like to choose their own future. So it's very strange why West not support idea of referendum, because it's about democracy. But we see that West to need recognize referendum, they do it, like in Sudan, for example, or like in Hatay province in Turkey in 1939. They also organized a referendum. It was taken from north of Syria to the Turkish territory. So we see it's normal. But they would not like recognize, and I think that's because of kind of racism and kind of Russophobia, because it's organized on ex-Ukraine territory that was before part of Russian Empire. And most of people speak Russian there. And also conflict started because of language question. And people on the south and east of Ukraine would like to continue speak mother language, Russian language. And Ukrainian nationalists who came to power after the coup promoted by the West, they banned to speak Russian language. It was the main problem. So we see now they back to the our motherland, to the Russia, and many investigators and many people from foreign countries and also from European countries visited this referendum, and they confirmed that it was transparent and was legal, and the legitimacy of the will of the people to choose the future. And very soon it will be official Russian regions.
But Mr. Sabin, many believe this has only been done to accomplish one objective, and that is to declare these regions as an integral part of Russia's mainland, thereby giving Russia an excuse to use its nuclear arsenal.
Yes, already there was attacks on the Russian region in Kursk, in Belgorod regions, and with use of conventional weapons from Ukrainian side. And in our doctrine and strategy of defense, we have option to use nuclear weapon to protect our territory if there will be needs. But I sure that at the moment we have opportunity and possibility to protect Russian territory with new regions by the classical military forces and with support of voluntary battalions and some private contract protective firms who already works in this area. So there is no need to use nuclear weapons. There will be maybe need when some type of escalation will start from Ukrainian side and from the side of the West.
Mr. Sabin, United Nations has not been fully neutral in this conflict with Russia. That is what we believe. That is what we have observed. United Nations session was largely boycotted by many countries when Russia's foreign minister was there to explain the rationale behind the attack in Ukraine. Also, for the first time, a leader of the state, Mr. Zelensky, was extended an opportunity to speak with a pre-recorded statement in UN. Also, the fact that there is a large discussion going on to deprive Russia of its veto right in the United Nations. How does the Russian nation look towards these developments?
Actually, there was a crisis for many years inside of United Nations because it's become like a platform to blah 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 talking, and there are no any results. But security service instrument is useful, and yes, we see that China is only one ally inside of security council who will support Russia, and Russia support China in other occasions. So there will be probably no result about discussion about incident on Nord Stream pipelines. But in General Assembly, many countries who take neutral position, for example, they prefer to keep silence because they're afraid of sanctions from United States. But many of them support Russia. Like now, because of personal talks of diplomats and experts from different countries and my personal experience. But of course, there is a sign of a serious crisis inside of United Nations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Savin, for being guest in our program today.
Thank you too.
Ladies and gentlemen, these were three different experts sharing their opinion with us about the geopolitics, about the military developments and the diplomacy that is largely at play in this entire conflict, or is trying to be at play in this conflict. But remember, there's one hidden corner of every crisis, and that is the economic side of it. For that, we have invited Dr. Bilal Begis, who as an economist and academic expert based in Istanbul, is joining us over Skype. Dr. Bilal, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Syed. Thanks for the invite.
Dr. Bilal, record high inflation, crashing stock market, rising gas prices, number of issues that are taking place in Europe. As an economic expert, how do you see these developments affecting the very fabric of European society?
Well, these especially rate hikes and monetary tightening, it is already absorbing a lot of liquidity from risky markets, including stock markets. And we have seen a lot of volatility in stock markets in the US, Europe, including Turkey. And these tightening steps, they actually have shifted cash from almost all markets towards the fixed income instruments and foreign exchange markets. So we have therefore seen a relatively high volatility recently in including commodity markets and stock markets. And in the European case, we should actually add huge waves of migration also to this distress. The war in Ukraine, especially over its impact on food and energy security in those two particular sectors, they have been the two most critical issues, actually. It has been affecting, of course, the European economies, the European region much more compared to the other parts of the world. So the impacts are relatively crystal clear, I would say, in Europe. And if you look at the various macro financial variables, for example, the inflation figures in the euro area, they are somewhere around 9%. And in countries like UK, in England, it is somewhere around 10%. In various other European economies, mainly because of food and energy price surge, inflation rates are somewhere around 30-year highs. In some cases, they are at 40-year highs. And if you look at the real economic activity on the other side, in 2020, Europe had a contraction of somewhere around 6%. And in 2021, there was a slight recovery. They had a growth rate of 5.4%. And this year, mainly due to the war in Ukraine, international organizations such as IMF, they have downward revised the growth rate for especially the euro area for Europe to somewhere around 2 to 3%.
Dr. Bilal Begis, I was reading a statement in Wall Street Journal. It says $2.8 trillion are going to be the damages, the overall cost of this war for the global economy. Would you agree with Wall Street Journal's statement?
The war, it is expected to affect global economy by at least a few $1 trillion. And one of the estimates is that one that you're talking about, the Wall Street Journal estimate. Actually, even at the very beginning of the war, the estimates, they were already at somewhere close to $1 trillion. And overall, especially various publications, data from international organizations, it shows that the war itself is expected to bring down the growth rate by, on average, 1%. I'm talking about the whole global economic growth. And then the average inflation rate, again, globally is expected to go up by somewhere around 3%. And the cost due to the war and also the following sanctions, it has actually been going up. And a lot of international organizations, they have been warning. And it has led to a lot of supply chain related issues, supply chain breaks, insurance and transportation costs, they have gone up, especially in the Black Sea region. And we're facing a lot of challenges in energy and food production in general. For example, financial institutions, insurance companies, they have been relatively more reluctant to accept deal in that region in food and energy sector in general. And increasing insurance and transportation costs, they have overall taken up prices and led to much higher inflation figures and much lower growth.
Dr. Bilal, with this development, the attack on Nord Stream, that is primarily the topic of today's program, the supply of gas to Europe is going to drastically change. How do you believe this is going to affect the overall market in Europe, the overall economic environment of Europe?
Well, it definitely is negatively impacting the energy markets. So Nord Stream 2, it is already inactive. It was completed, but never started. Nord Stream 1, on the other hand, it is turned off for maintenance. And Europe, they actually were, indeed, they were in the past, so far they resisted the, especially US pushes for oil price caps for relatively long periods. And it seems like, especially the latest Nord Stream 1 shutdown, it will definitely negatively affect Europe, the Europeans, and at least several winters in the future, they are likely to be very, very difficult, and it will lead to higher energy bills and probably a lot of anger towards the politicians, institutions in Europe, and it will negatively affect especially energy-intensive industries mostly. And Europe will need US's, Norway's, and other players like Qatar and North African energy suppliers help, a lot of coordination with that type of countries, and probably even Turkey's support in diversifying its energy sources. Otherwise, it doesn't look that good, actually. And Europe is dependent upon energy imports from Russia a lot. So 25% of the oil import in Europe, it's coming from Russia.
But Dr. Bilal, I'll cut you here, because these countries do not have a direct gas pipeline, the countries that you have listed out, which means that the supply of gas cannot be as good as being supplied through a pipeline. And the cost for Germany is going to be extremely high, because Germany's industry cannot survive, cannot manufacture in these winters without gas being used as an input. What do you think of it?
I would would say there will probably be more demand for nuclear energy and return to coal plantations for electricity production, and there will be more focus on renewable energy sources. And Germany is doing relatively better, actually, in that sense, especially in renewable energy sources. And recently, a group of European economies, they were actually working on forcing Europe, the Commission and European Union to accept nuclear energy as a renewable source. And they did achieve that. On the Germany side, it seems like inflation rate, again, is relatively high, particularly for Germany. There is an 8% inflation. There are actually much bigger concerns regarding higher inflation in energy and food especially. And Germany is the main hub of European energy imports. They will be impacted the most, therefore. And as I mentioned earlier, the newly built Nord Stream 2 project that was planned to carry natural gas from Russia to Germany, it is paused. It's not active. And supply from Nord Stream 1, it is shut down currently. And that huge source of especially natural gas, Russia, which holds about 20% of the global reserves, it's basically not supplying anything to Europe, especially to Germany. So things don't look that good. But in the meantime, German citizens, they are moving to Turkey for winter. That we are sure, but it is not clear what the plans are for.
Dr. Bilal Biggis, there are some more sanctions underway against Russia, and these have been highlighted by various organizations of Europe. News have been published in various media outlets saying that another $6.7 billion of damage will be caused by the Russian economy. How do you believe these sanctions are going to hurt Russia further?
Well, Russia is already the most sanctioned economy on earth. Following this annexation of the 4 regions of Ukraine, the West, Europe, and U.S., they are planning to impose new sanctions. And for the U.S. side, it seems like they are focusing more on the energy exports. And Europe, on the other hand, they are focusing on the aviation industry, tires, brakes, and electrical components. In terms of the financial parameters, they didn't work that well, right? Russia seems to doing relatively better than it was expected. But this type of sanctions, they definitely do affect economies, the relative economies, and Russia in particular. It is expected to actually contract this year in 2022. Somewhere between 8% to 20%. We're not sure about the exact real impact, but there will definitely be some type of contraction overall, I would say, despite the relatively better performance in financial parameters.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bilal Biggis, for being guest in our program today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are still underrating. We are still underestimating the cost of the escalation between Ukraine and Russia. If things go out of hands from here, it will not remain to be a regional dispute. We'll join you next week with another program. And until then, Allah Hafiz.